Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Kinzel. I'm the director of the Palo Alto Art Center. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the first in what will be two artist panel discussions in conjunction with the Fire Transforms exhibition at the Palo Alto Art Center. I've got a flyer here for the next talk, which will be on Friday, December 9th, same time, focused on creating with fire. I encourage you all to join that as well. Fire Transforms is part of a series of exhibitions, Climate Connections, at the Palo Alto Art Center this year. And the series acknowledges that art and artists can help communicate about climate change in a unique and powerful way. I'd like to thank all of the artists in the Fire Transforms exhibition for sharing their work and their vision with all of us in the community. I want to thank the entire exhibitions team at the Art Center, particularly Joseph Sachs, our preparator, and Amy Cohen, our exhibitions registrar, for their work to install this beautiful show. I also want to thank my colleagues, Sharday Walker and Karen Kwan behind the scenes, who helped to make this Zoom talk possible. And I'd also like to thank the members and donors at the Palo Alto Art Center Foundation who have helped to make who have helped to fund free programs and free admission exhibitions like this one. Thank you so much for your support of the Art Center and the Foundation. Finally, I would like to thank our guest curator for the exhibition, Rina Faletti. Art historian and curator Rina Faletti, PhD, organizes exhibitions and public programs about wildfire as a direct response to a need for community gathering, processing, and healing after catastrophic wildfire events. She is the founding director of Art Responds. Welcome, Rina, and thank you so much for your work to curate such a beautiful show for our community.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Special welcome to the four artists who will be participating today. Karen and I will be moderating our discussion today, including the Q&A, which will be any question that you have. Go ahead and write it in the Q&A area, and then we can answer those questions as we go along. Today, we have 4 out of the 17 artists who participated in the Fire Transforms exhibition, which is going through December 10th. Hopefully, you've seen it once and you want to see it again. If you haven't seen it again at first, go see it. I'll be giving a tour tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the museum in case you're interested in coming to the Art Center for that. Today, we welcome 4 artists: Felicia Rice, Adam Shaw, Brian Fies, and Gregory Roberts. All of these artists are in this theme of tonight's panel called Living with Fire, because in one way or another, they directly came in contact with the wildfires that have stricken Central California between 2017 and 2020. They'll tell their own stories and the ways that their art projects that resulted in their exhibition pieces for Fire Transforms came about. And I'm going to go ahead and let them each do that and introduce them in between. First of all, we have Felicia Rice, and she is, I will simply say that she is a printmaker, a letterpress printer, and an artist book creator and collector whose home and studio were burned in the 2020 fires in the Santa Cruz area. She's done a ton of work around wildfire and wildfire recovery as an artist since then. And I would like to welcome you, Felicia, and thank you for presenting tonight.
Thank you so much. Let me get started with my presentation. So, Moving Parts Press, Rising from the Ashes. In 1977, I founded Moving Parts Press in downtown Santa Cruz, where I entertained clients and authors, artists and students for over a decade before moving the press to the mountains of Santa Cruz. My letterpress shop and my entire archive of artist books was destroyed in the CZU Lightning Complex fire in August 2020, as we said. I've relocated to Mendocino, and with the help of 800 individuals, organizations, and institutions, I've reestablished Moving Parts Press here in my childhood home. I think of myself as a printer, an artist, and a publisher. As a printer, my job is to confront complex issues and render my response to them in book form. As an artist, my job is to do so with profound integrity. As a publisher, my job is to make these issues public. As printers have done every decade since Gutenberg, I'm here to argue for a more just society. With one foot firmly planted in the 19th century and the other in the 21st, I employ traditional typography and bookmaking methods together with digital technology to bring the flexibility of screen-based design to the texture and history of the letterpress printed page. Over a 45-year period, I had built a complete letterpress print shop with a beautiful Victoria platen press and 2 Vandercook proof presses. I had a very fine collection of 200 cases of metal type of the highest quality, irreplaceable, inherited from the fine printer Sherwood Grover. I had just finished this book with T.J. Demos, The Necropolitics of Extraction, when the fire struck. The irony is that the book addresses issues of extraction and the climate crisis. We know that the California wildfires are precipitated by drought and climate change. Most of this edition of 40 books was destroyed. Moving Parts Press was located here in Bonnie Doon. We had rented the house for 25 years. Here is the house at 6 o'clock, the evening of August 19, 2020. Here is the scene 12 hours later, the morning of August 20th. Our neighborhood just below Alba Road and to the either side of Empire Grade was devastated. 20 out of 21 houses were destroyed. This is all that was left of my shop. Here are my 2 Vandercook proof presses with a type cabinet toppled over between them. The only evidence of thousands of pieces of metal type is a few rivulets of lead. Lead type melts at just over 600 degrees. With the average temperature of a house fire ranging from 1 to 2,000 degrees, thousands of beautiful letters were vaporized. But we were simply renters. We didn't own the property, so we were able to pull up stakes and move north to my family home here in the town of Mendocino. Here's our house. The shed where I've worked for the last 2 years is in the back. So the first home of Moving Parts Press in Mendocino was the 100-year-old shed that my artist father had used as his studio for the last 40 years. I wouldn't have thought it possible, but due to the incredible generosity of so many, I was able to pivot from scrambling for the very survival of the press to a dream of thriving in a new building. Plans for a new studio to replace the existing shed went before the Mendocino Historical Review Board at the end of 2020. In October, 2 months after the fire, a crew of 6 moved a Vandercook proof press out of calligrapher Judy Dietrich's root cellar just 6 miles away into the shed. In November, I began printing my first broadsides on the new press. The broadsides are dedicated to recovery from the fires of the previous summer. They are hanging in this exhibit. I selected poems by Santa Cruz Poems Ellen Bass, Danusha Lamaris, and Gary Young. Each poem addresses issues of loss and recovery in the face of crisis. The images are a drawing of my own, a photo from our burn site by Grace Brieger, and a woodcut by Gary Young. They are available at Bookshop Santa Cruz. All proceeds have been donated to the recovery of the Santa Cruz Mountain community from the devastating wildfires of 2 years ago. This is the other piece in this exhibit. It is a spread from the limited edition artist book Heavy Lifting that I've been working on since before the fire in close collaboration with Mendocino County poet Teresa Whitehill. But the heavy lifting, the shaping and execution of the book have taken place over the last 2 years. It is a direct response to crisis, my individual and our collective crisis during the pandemic. The front accordion fold panel rests into and almost obscures the taller birds panel behind. The relentless drumbeat of our collective crises, COVID, healthcare, prisons, racism, politics, immigration, climate, and housing during this time almost obscure the rising spirit represented by the birds. I incorporated this verse from Teresa's poem into the birds panel. So this partial journey, you might complete it. There's no guarantee. You will map the energy of the gods to the little that you have been able to pin down, and you will be proud of your energy and your love, your energies and your loves, your lovely energy, your proud love, your willingness to mingle in the halls of the dead, bringing the dead treasures that cause their eyes to light up, putting smiles back on faces that have lost flesh. You will speak to birds. I printed the rear panel of Heavy Lifting, the birds panel, in the shed, but I printed the front panel, the crises panel, in a shipping container on the job site directly in the path of sawdust and dirt blown by heavy spring winds. I'm now a full-fledged member of the tiny press movement. Compared with the shed, the container was luxurious in size, but gritty. Once underway in May of this year, the building process was fascinating to watch. For months, the crew went to work every morning at 8 a.m., and so did I. By August, they were able to move the press into the new studio. This was the fifth and the last move of my Vandercook proof press in just under 2 years. And now it rests in this corner of the beautiful new home of Moving Parts Press. In 2 years, I've been able to rebuild my shop from absolutely nothing to this beautiful space of 360 square feet. Home at last. During the last 2 years, I've begun publishing poems and broadsides online on my website. Poems for George Floyd and In Ukraine poems by Bobo Soleil, and A Virus Held Us, pandemic poems by Lynn Ellis. This effort is the opposite of creating a limited edition. The point is to get the word out there as fast and as widely as possible. Another ongoing project, Latinx Chicanx Poetics, is a portfolio of 15 broadsides by contemporary queer Latinx Chicanx poets and is co-edited with Angel Dominguez and Hannah Kazima. It was begun in Santa Cruz and will be finished in Mendocino in 2023. This project is the 13th in a larger series devoted to Chicanx Latinx poets and artists, begun in 1989. Venus Envy, chapters 1 through 4, with Amalia Mesa Baines, documents Amalia's 4-part series of installations executed over several decades to chronicle 4 chapters of her life as a Chicana woman. The first installation is currently on display at SF MoMA, and a complete retrospective of her work is scheduled for this winter at the Berkeley Art Museum. So please visit movingpartspress.com for more on my projects and publications. To finish, The Thing Is by Ellen Bass. To love life, to love it even when you have no stomach for it, and everything you've held dear crumbles like dirt paper in your hands. Your throat is filled with the silt of it. When grief sits with you, its tropical heat thickening the air, heavy as water, more fit for gills than lungs. When grief wakes you like your own flesh, only more of it, an obesity of grief. You think, how can a body withstand this? Then you hold life like a face between your palms, a plain face, no charming smile, no violet eyes, and you say, yes, I will take you. I will love you again. And there we are.
Thank you,
back?
Felicia. Yes. Thank you so much. Very moving presentation, and we're feeling your experience and how you translated it into art, and we'll ask you some questions about that at the end. Participants who are watching, you have the option to fill in your Q&A questions at any time, but we won't be answering questions until the end. So either hold on to them or go ahead and type them in, but we'll let all 4 artists do their presentations first. Next, we'll have Brian Fies. Brian Fies is a graphic artist and graphic novelist who's published 4 or 5 now of his wonderful works, which you can find and read. The one we're focusing on today for this exhibition is called A Fire Story, and relates and reflects on his own experiences with wildfire in 2017. Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all. Thanks for everybody who's watching, and thank you, Rina, for curating this show in the first place. I think it's wonderful. I also have a presentation I'd like to share with you all here. Click on that, make it big. Oops, yep, hold on. There we go. That should look right. Yeah, my name is Brian Fies, and I'm my contribution to the exhibition is 8 pages of original artwork for my graphic novel, A Fire Story, plus a video that accompanies them. Just be clear, a graphic novel is just a less vulgar term for a big comic book. Usually a self-contained story with a beginning, middle, and an end. And I kind of embrace the idea of comics being the people's art. And so I was very happy to be asked to be part of this show. This is what my exhibition or my walls look like at the Palo Alto Art Center. I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, I'm a cartoonist who's published graphic novels that Rina alluded to, include a book called Mom's Cancer, one called Whatever Happened to the World of Tomorrow, and one called The Last Mechanical Monster, which just came out. I live near Santa Rosa, California, and on October 9th, 2017, my wife and I looked out our window and saw this coming over the hill at us. This is the Tubbs Fire, which in a few hours swept through about 15 miles of terrain and destroyed about 3,000 homes, including mine. This is a different view from a hilltop some distance away. Now, all the yellow lights in the foreground, those are just overexposed street lights, but everything off on the horizon is a fire that proceeded from right to left, from east to west, jumped from here to here, over. Everything on the horizon is a fire skipping along. And as best I can figure, my house is right over here in the middle of Mordor somewhere. Tubbs was one of several fires that burned over the next week or longer. Here's what we all looked like from space. Again, I am right in the middle of that. So about 5 hours after the fire tore through our neighborhood, we figure, the sun came up and I walked back into our neighborhood to see what was left because I hadn't heard, I didn't know. We weren't getting any news. We weren't hearing any reports. So I walked back into our neighborhood to see what was left. And this is what my street looked like the next morning. I'm astonished that this is just a few hours after the fire. The fire, we figure, came through our neighborhood about 2 a.m. and I was back in there about 8 a.m. And in that amount of time, it destroyed something like 200 homes just in our neighborhood. That's my front door. On the right, you can see a refrigerator that's left over. And then back, you can see I think it's a washer or dryer. And if you look carefully, you can still see little spot fires off in the distance there. Just little spots here and there. I think those might be gas lines still burning. So the next day I went to, we moved in with our daughters who live in Novato for a month. And the next day I went to a Target store and I bought shoes because I had evacuated without shoes on, without proper shoes. I'd put sandals on because they were closest to the bed. And I bought shirts and I bought pants and I bought underwear and I bought some food and all the things you buy. And I bought art supplies. This is all the art supplies I could find at a Target store. It was a spiral bound book of really terrible quality paper, 4 colored Sharpies or 4 colored highlighters and a couple of pens and pencils. Because I knew I'd be telling our story. I began my career as a newspaper reporter and I've worked as a freelance journalist and I felt that kind of journalism gear kick in. So even while I walked through my neighborhood in shock, I knew I had to pay attention. So I took photos I could reference later. Like I took off the photo on the left that became the text on the right, which says a fire hose split and melted on the street. A valiant last stand routed into retreat. The picture on the left is a fallen basketball hoop that a boy lobbed balls at for hours every night after dinner. The steel posts of mailboxes bent like hot summer taffy. Now, these are very sketchy drawings. I draw better than this, but I was drawing fast. I was working urgently. I wanted to get our story out while it was still fresh. And it was also not the most important thing in my life. I mean, my house had just burned down. So there's a lot that goes along with that. You got a lot of phone calls to make when that happens, a lot of things to do. So I was telling this story at the same time I was dealing with the shock and all the practical things that go into dealing with your house going away. So within a few days, I produced 16 pages of comics and I started putting them online. I put them on a blog, my blog. I have a personal blog. It went viral. Oh, and this is what that looked like. The first line of my book and my webcomic is, "On Monday, my house disappeared." I put it on a blog, and within a couple of weeks, well, I'm not where I thought I was. There's my blog. Within a couple of weeks, I had 500,000 people came to read this. And I take some credit for that because I think I did a good job writing and drawing it. But what people said was, I saw your fire on the news. I saw the mushroom cloud rising over the Sonoma County plains, but your story was the first thing I saw that made me feel what it was like to be there. And that's why I did it. And that's the most gratifying reaction I could have imagined. Shortly afterward, a couple of weeks, I was contacted by San Francisco PBS station KQED, which asked me, hey, would you mind if we tried to animate that? And I said, knock yourselves out. I'm not going to animate it. So KQED put together a 6-minute video that narrated by my wife and me, and hundreds of thousands, maybe a couple million more people saw that, and it actually won an Emmy Award. So that was, that was nice. And that's what's on display in the Palo Alto Art Center on the left wall. There is that video that KQED made using the artwork from my web comic. After that, my book publisher Abrams asked if I'd be willing to turn the story into a full-length book, and I was. So I used the opportunity to expand the story both in time and space. I wanted to cover more time than the few days after the fire. I wanted to go into weeks and months after the fire. I wanted to expand it in space because I realized my perspective was limited to where I lived and what I'd seen. I wanted to interview other people and get their fire stories, talk to people who were richer than me and poorer than me and lived in other places. And actually one woman who didn't lose her house, but still had a very dramatic and heart-rending story to tell, I thought. So these are, that's the book we printed. And these are the more finished, polished story pages that are in the book. Again, the story starts out on Monday, my house disappeared. And this is the original art that's on display in the Palo Alto Art Center. Now, what I wanted to do with the Palo Alto Art Center, I wanted to mention too that these original pages, the black and white ones, are done in India ink and brush pen over non-photo blue pencil on Bristol board, for those of you who are interested in that kind of detail. Because my art is so explicitly narrative, I mean, it's literally created to tell a story, I thought it was important for visitors to understand it in that context. Comics aren't just drawings, they're drawings with text, and neither the pictures or words express their full meaning without the other. So I wanted to, and everybody agreed that it'd be a nice thing to show the original artwork along with how it appeared in the book with the words and the colors and everything in place. And I think that's just real nice. So that the art itself is just the start of the storytelling process. So with each piece, I want to include that page as it was published so people would get that storytelling. So I'm going to come out of sharing, and there it is, stop share. There. As I say, happily, Rina and the Palo Alto Art Center agreed with that idea, and I couldn't be more pleased or proud of how they integrated my work with the idea of with the rest of the art in the show. Bigger picture, I've said before, I've often said and believe that one artist's perspective on a subject as big as fire or disaster or recovery or resilience is necessarily limited. They see it through their lens. They express it through their particular medium. But I think if you get several artists' perspectives on the same subject, as the Palo Alto Art Center has done, I think you really get a rich, deep insight into that experience, into that disaster, into that fire, into that big thing, that big question, that big issue. Like some people said of my comic, an exhibition like the Palo Alto Art Center's really helps you understand what it felt like to be there. And I'm happy that I'm a little piece of that. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate your thoughtfulness and your images and your story. Again, save your questions or put them in now. We'll address all the questions at the end. Next, I'd like to invite Adam Shaw to present his work. Adam, before the fires, I think, considered himself strictly a painter or mostly a painter. And now, since the fires, he'll tell you his story of how it developed. His art took a different turn into a more multimedia and possibly sculptural turn. He will now present his story of his relationship living with fire and how his art came to be in the exhibition. Thanks, Adam. You're on mute, Adam. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much, Rina. Thank you, Karen, and all the folks down in Palo Alto. I feel really honored and humbled to be a part of this incredible exhibition. And I'm going to give you a little slideshow and talk about how fire has affected me. So we're going to go into the slideshow. I've been practicing to stay technically proficient here. So there are a lot of ways to talk about living with and through fire. Being that this is part of an exhibition called Fire Transforms, I'm going to tell the story of the transformation of my work as an artist. It's hard to believe that it was 5 years ago, but on October 8th in 2017, I stepped out of my house in the Sonoma Valley to watch the moon, which was almost full. And there was an eerie hot wind blowing, like 60 miles an hour. And as I watched the moon, I thought of the question asked by Paul Bowles in The Sheltering Sky: how many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20, and yet it all seems so limitless. The reason I cherish these lines so much—
Adam, just a small note that we cannot see your slides.
You cannot see my slides.
Correct.
Okay, let's try this. Share.
Yeah, there you go. It looks like it may. And then
Okay.
slideshow.
Okay. Bear with me, folks.
Perfect.
Great.
Okay, so I wanted to show here's the first slide, which was the moon and the Paul Bowles quote. And then we were here. So the reason that I love that quote by Bowles about how many more times will I watch the moon rise is that that quote serves as a powerful reminder of the transient and fleeting nature of reality. And it acts as a call to be more present and appreciative. And for me, this is perhaps the highest function of any art, be it poetry, music, painting, dance, the call to be present. So I made this work called The Thread after the fire. It involved painting, burning, and repairing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that process later. So after the fire, I went inside into my cozy living room, and it was so warm and glowing in there. I took a photograph of my guitars, and I sat down on the floor to play a guitar. And within a few minutes, I started to smell smoke. So I stood up to look out the window, which looked east across the Sonoma Valley, and I saw a raging orange fire coming over the hills. I called to my son, whose room was downstairs, and I said, "Gabe, grab the animals, we're out of here, there's a fire coming." And literally within less than 5 minutes, we were out of the house with the animals and nothing more than the clothes on our back. I want to say something about that strange, elusive thing that we call beauty. Despite the tragedy, panic, and horror that accompanied almost every step of this journey, from the very moment I looked at the fire across the valley, I was overwhelmed with how beautiful it was. And in its own way, each step of this process contained beauty. When we got on the road, it was really treacherous. There were burning branches and fiery embers being tossed everywhere, and the wind was howling, but we managed to make it to my ex-wife's house in Santa Rosa. And after we were there for about a half an hour, I started to smell smoke again. And I walked out of her door and saw a scene worthy of Hieronymus Bosch. People were running down the street covered with ash, and they were screaming that there was a fire down the street. So once again, we grabbed the dog and the cat, and we fled from fire for a second time in one night. Whether you call it fate or accident, there's no way to explain or comprehend it. Although I was told that my house had burned down, in fact, it was saved. It was as if a bubble were placed over it and everything outside that bubble burned. This Buddha was just paces from my front door, and you can see the burn line and what extended beyond it. My ex didn't fare so well. Her house burned to the ground that night. It was about a month before I was able to return home because the fires were still blazing and my town was under mandatory evacuation. But living in a hotel, unable to work, I conceived of an installation I wanted to make based upon the fire. I put together a small team and we mapped out the entire thing, from drawing the exhibition to the cost of labor, equipment, fundraising, storage, everything. I had very grand ideas, such as suspending burned vehicles from the rafters and draping them in red silk, to retrieving freestanding chimneys from houses that had burned to the ground and wrapping them in gauze, and creating sculptures from I-beams of burned buildings and other such grand installations. I went to the Museum of Sonoma County and introduced myself to the director, Jeff Nathanson. I gave him a copy of a book of my paintings, so he knew I was for real, and my proposal. It was going to cost a fortune. And at that time, thousands of people had lost their homes and everything they owned. No one was thinking about funding a multi-million-dollar art project, and there really wasn't a facility capable of mounting a show of that scope. But that's what I had in mind. But as soon as I got back home to my studio, I resolved that I was going to spend a year making work based upon fire. I had no idea what the work would be, where I was going to show it, or who would be in it, but I was going to dedicate a year of my life to making it. So I started burning paintings. And I started using corrosive acids and fire combined with minuscule amounts of paint to pay homage to the moon, Paul Bowles' moon, on the night of the fire. I made dozens, even 100 of these. And the process evolved from making moons to making the Earth to making planets. And then I got a call. It was from Jeff, almost a year after we spoke. He told me that his museum was going to mount an exhibition based upon the fires and offered me the ability to do an installation. Of course, far less expansive than what I had initially involved, but nonetheless significant and real. By that time, almost all of the burned vehicles were gone, but I managed to find this truck, which one of my neighbors who lost his house gave to me. It became the centerpiece of my installation, which I call Beauty Born in Flames. That installation consisted of the planetary wall, 6 panels, which were a narrative of the entire process of living through the fire, and the truck, in the bed of which I created this tableau of the Buddha, sitting with ashes, painted bones, and dried roses, staring into a mirror, symbolically contemplating the most profound question of all: who am I? And here you see a portion of the planetary wall, which has been recreated for the current Fire Transforms exhibition in Palo Alto. Now I'd like to say something about how the fire has had a long-lasting and transformational effect on my work, and show you some pieces from the last few years. I'm not the same painter that I used to be. I always believed in building up and breaking down surfaces, and that taking away was as important as adding and making a work of art, but I was a purist, an oil painter. But since the fires, I have been much more emboldened in my work, using many materials, often downright destroying things as part of the creative process. So here you see my painting Witness on the left, with a detail on the right showing some of the destruction and repair involved in making the work. And here's another painting from that series called Song of Orpheus, based upon the poetry of Rilke, and a detail showing the way I approach making flowers in this series, which has to do with painting the flowers, burning them, and then tearing them apart. I'm still fundamentally an oil painter. But even in the paintings that haven't been distressed or wounded or partially destroyed, fire as a theme or visual element keeps showing up in my work, such as in this piece, which looks like a room with 2 chairs that's burning. and this one called Red House after the Jimi Hendrix song. And this one called Burn Room. And finally, this one called Blue Chair after the song by Elvis Costello, in which gauze is painted into the canvas, but it's set free to drape over the chair. So indeed, I'm a living example that fire does transform not only the materials of the artist, but the artist himself. It has led me to make works that are wounded, repaired, and healed, but made more beautiful by their scars. As the 16th century alchemist Paracelsus said, all things must go through fire in order to attain a new birth. That's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Can you stop your share? It should be down in the bottom. It'll say stop share.
For some reason, the Zoom window kind of disappeared from me. There we go. Sorry about that.
Got it. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Adam, for your insights and showing us so much of your work. Next, I've saved Gregory Roberts' presentation for the end for just as important a reason as we organized the rest of the speakers, how they did. Gregory has a tremendous had a tremendous project that enabled him to see how many people experienced the wildfires in Sonoma County in 2017. As a ceramic artist and in many different ways, Gregory has worked in his own work and also has taught studio art at Sonoma State University. But he'll talk about the project that he created in ceramic for the Tubbs fire in 2017. Thanks a lot, Gregory, for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this really wonderful exhibition with a really outstanding group of artists. It's great. It's great to be a part of it. So yeah, my name is Gregory Roberts. I used to teach ceramics at Sonoma State University, and in 2017, like a whole bunch of other people, I was woken up in the middle of the night by glowing red skies, and I was fortunate enough. My house didn't burn. But I think I lived approximately, I think I figured out it's like maybe like less than 7 miles from Bryan. And so I mean, it was really random. The whole thing was so random because like then 1 block away, 2 houses burned and a part of an apartment building burned. So yeah, so the fact that my house was spared was a bit of random good luck. But anyway, what I used to do is I used to make odd objects. I've always made very like oddball things. So like these are some cell phone amplifiers that I was making for a while. But for most of my career, I was working with honeycomb ceramics, and like most recently, like these pieces were purchased by Bill Gates for and it was behind him during the COVID, when he was talking about COVID at a TED talk. But so I had been doing this for many years, but then I had finally purchased a house, and then the fires struck, right? So so this is the Tubbs fire map, and And it was the kind of thing when I first conceived this project was as the ash was actually falling from the sky onto my studio. And the thing about ash is that it is an essential part of a glaze. So I'm a little bit of a ceramic nerd, so I was sort of like, wow, like there's a connection here, but I don't quite know what it is. And so wood ash is the oldest form of a glaze, and so I had this idea that I would try to make objects for people who had lost their homes. And so I put together a little flyer and I said, please send me the ashes from your home and I will try to make a ceramic object for you. So that was the easy part, sort of like coming up with this idea. The hard part was figuring out how could I possibly get a hold of people when this was these were the neighborhoods. Everybody had disappeared, and so I eventually got in touch with a couple of community organizations, and they helped to get me in touch with individuals. There were a lot of problems with this. Like I had tried doing it with the university, but the university shut it down. And so I was just like, well, I'm just going to do it on my own. But there were problems because we didn't know about the levels of toxicity that was in the ash. But I went ahead and did it anyway. But I did it with the support of some really key individuals that really helped me to see the project through, and I'm very, very grateful for them. So in November, after the fires, I put out a little bin at my front door, and people would drop off the ashes from their homes, and I knew it was charged, but I didn't quite realize how charged that act was. And so I would come home every day from work, and then there would be more and more little packets of ashes. And this was all that they had left from their homes. It grew pretty quickly. And so I was just like, well, how do you keep bags of dirt organized? And so we came up with a documentation system and a little spreadsheet, and everything got like a little officious where we're doing all this. And then we would end up coming across letters like this, where I am, I'm sort of like doing my thing, and then I read through this letter, which is basically telling me how this is my life. This is all what you have in this bag is all I have left from 40 years of memories. And that was when the weight of the project really began to hit home. And I still had not totally a clear idea of how I was going to create individual objects for people. And then also the other thing, that the rains were starting, so I would sort of put out more things, letting people know, like, this is a way that you can, keep the ashes or make ashes from the materials. So by the end of November, I had about 95 things, 95 little packets, and that grew eventually to about 140. So getting back to this idea of like, well, how does ash create a glaze? Well, what happens is like during a wood firing, the wood ash sort of drifts through the kilns and it rests on the shoulders of these big pots. And that's how that's how mankind figured out that if we can get the temperature hot enough, you can create a surface that is a glaze. And so the Tubbs fire reached 2000 degrees, which is that crucial temperature. This image that you see here is the round barn, which is an iconic architectural structure in Santa Rosa that had burned. And this was, a couple of days afterwards. And so I had this really amazing gift that was given to me, and I took it very, very seriously. 140 participants decided that they wanted to be a part of this thing that we don't yet know what it is. So along with cataloging, also the ashes needed to be cleaned and processed so that they could be transformed into a material. And every time I would get completely overwhelmed, some amazing individual would get in touch with me and say, how can I help? And Liz Neves, who you see here, called me out of the blue and said, look, you have my ashes. My home burned down. I need to do something. And so it became a way for her to be a part of healing her community by working with me. And then the question was like, so all right, so how do we begin to create objects that are going to give people this sense of place? And that's where the round barn came in. It was something that I could sort of create on the wheel, that was that symbolized the round barn. And then so I proceeded to start throwing pots, which is what I do. I'm a potter. And so this is roughly the process where you take 6 pounds of clay to make the vessel and 4 pounds for the lid. And then you do the first firing, which is called a bisque firing. And then we take the glaze and we mix a very specific portion of the ash with the glaze and put that in the center. And that's what these rings are. And then they're fired. And we ended up with something completely unknowable, which was that every single address became completely unique. Every glaze was completely unique to that person's address. And to me, that was amazing. That was wonderful. And and so these are some of the results that people got. I know for myself, I mean, it was making a bunch of pots, but it was also very much about trying to hold the memory for a community, and then to eventually offer the community back something because they had trusted me with these, this very precious material. And so yeah, there we are. Eventually, the exhibition came up. And so this is all 140 pieces for the individuals of the community. And then, I very much am super grateful to Jeff and everybody at the museum. They did a remarkable job helping me to coming up with this amazing display unit, as well as this really wonderful map so that we could actually, so each person was able to take their number and identify their home on the map. So each piece, was, had a specific location noted to it. And at the end of the exhibition, we were able to gift the pieces to all of the individuals. So everybody that chose to participate were able to take this piece to their new home. And that process in itself was very, it was very, very emotional. We had a big thing at the end of the show, but not everybody was able to get their pieces. So we ended up, I ended up holding a series of open houses where people would come and pick up their piece, and then they would often tell me the story of how they lost their home. So so that's what happened. Thanks.
Thank you so much. If the rest of our audience and speakers are like me, there's not a dry eye in the crowd. I have found all four of your stories so moving. It's just amazing to me as a curator to see artists immediately begin to create immediately after the disaster. All four of you in one way or the other has said, like Gregory did, I conceived of this project while the ash was still falling immediately after the fire, and presumably while fire was still raging in the area. I too am from the area and had to flee the fires for several months, and so understand that feeling. What I'd like to ask the four of you to start with before we entertain the audience's questions, and please feel free to write your questions in, listeners, to the Q&A area, and then Karen will bring them to the artists in a moment. I really want to know how this has always fascinated me about artists since I've been working with climate change and environmental crisis, and with the wildfires specifically for shows like this one. What are you made of as an artist and a person that allows you, literally while the ash is still falling, within moments or days after, the fire has, or the trauma has set in, hasn't even set in yet, while the rest of us who don't create art are still in shock, can't move, we're frozen, don't know what to do. How are you able really to start making so quickly? What is it as part, maybe you don't know, but what is it as an artist, do you think, that allows you to be able to respond and start making something significant from your genre or your artwork right away? Brian, would you like to start?
Yeah, I've thought about this because I've been asked it a fair number of times.
I'm sure you have. Yeah.
And, all I know is that when I was walking into my neighborhood 6 hours after it burned down, I was self-aware enough to know I was going into shock. I was stunned and, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It looked like an atomic bomb had gone off. But I was also aware that I had a little pair of eyeballs floating over my shoulder saying to me, pay attention to this because you're going to be telling this story later. I've always got this second piece of my brain that's watching me watch things and observing how I observe them. And I've always got that detached thing that is always kind of hovering there. I also think, sort of slightly bigger picture, slightly longer term, that my wife has noted this about me. This tends to be how I deal with trauma, by processing it, by writing about it, by drawing about it, by telling the stories about it. And I think part of that is because it's something I can control. I'm not a firefighter. I can't put out the fires, which raged not just one night. They raged for a couple of weeks after October 9th, October 8th. I couldn't do anything stop that, to help people. But what I could do is I could tell the story, and within the telling of that story, I'm in complete control of that story. So I think it's, you know, psychologically, it gives me a handle on this thing that's just too big for me to otherwise handle.
Thank you. Gregory, I see you nodding.
Yeah,
Would you like to contribute?
Sure. I totally agree with Brian. I love that idea of, but because I've never quite really been able to identify what it is, but I love this idea of like the two eyes off to the side, sort of like, and I think there is something about an artistic training that teaches you to sort of extract yourself from a situation, to take in some ways either a bigger view or a more microscopic view. And for me, like I was in my studio and I was like, ash, what is ash? Ash is spiritual. Ash is like, and like, so like playing this sort of word association, and eventually sort of like realizing, well, it is an essential component to, you know, the base of the process. And so how can I focus my energies into that instead of into my own trauma? And having that is what kept me a little bit sane.
Mhm.
Over
Thank you.
that time.
Felicia, Adam?
Yeah, I would like to say something. You know, we don't know why we're here. We don't know what we are, where we come from, where we're going, and what is going on here. But art makes sense in a world that doesn't make any sense. And in a certain way, to engage in the creative process, like Gregory just said, keeps you sane or a little saner. And it adds meaning when there really kind of is no meaning. And the other aspect of that is, I feel like it's such a privilege in a way to be an artist, and that part of my service to that privilege is to pay for the cost of my arising, to be in service to it. And that doesn't stop just because the fucking walls are burning down, pardon me, because the walls are burning down. It's, as a matter of fact, it gets heightened. It's just like putting a fire underneath the water, it just boils over. So, I mean, you know, I was making drawings like the next day, like as the ashes were falling. So I feel like you can't stop. You can't stop.
Thank you so much. Felicia, did you want to speak about that? You're muted. Felicia's in a place where she has a little delay.
Okay,
There you go.
Nope,
okay.
she's still muted.
Now I'm
Okay.
not.
Now you're good.
So my situation includes the fact that almost immediately a colleague suggested starting a GoFundMe, crowdsourcing, and the response was incredible. So it comes in a flood at first, and my role was rapidly administrative, like just having this focused, I need to respond to all these folks, I need to monitor this, I need to be a part of this, and so if I ever thought that I was going to stop being a printer and become a painter or take up feather work, or this was the moment, but my community just was so strong and the message was so loud. What I heard was, we love you, keep doing what you're doing, don't stop, keep going. And so my recovery was fixing it, fix, so that I could continue doing what I do. And part of that simultaneously was actually doing it as a way of processing, which is what people have talked about.
Thank you so much. Such an insightful response and helpful to me as a curator of environmental artists. I know Karen, as the center director, is constantly thinking about how art relates to community. And so I think, Karen, did you have a question that you wanted to pose to the artists about joining a group show that was focused on community?
Yes, thank you, Rina. So I appreciated hearing from all of you about your individual practices, and clearly you're exhibiting and publishing your work independently. But I wondered if you could speak to the value of showing your work in a community context like this, in which you're with other artists who've had similar experiences.
I'll just say that this has been so resonant for me, the opportunity to share space with those who've also experienced so much, because I had to bounce from the Santa Cruz Mountains to a new community. I didn't have the opportunity to go through the recovery process with my neighbors or with the community that's been struggling and the folks who've been really struggling to rebuild or to find new homes or to get their feet back under them. So being in a group exhibition, hearing from other artists, so important to me. My work is characterized by work in community, and I'm actually in the midst of working with an art historian, and we're writing the story of Moving Parts Press, which sort of toward the end, there's a fire. And but this title of the book is Community as Art, the story of Moving Parts Press. So that's key to my art practice, this collaborative work, primarily with the Chicano arts community for many years.
I kind of said my piece on this earlier when I was talking about different artists coming at the same thing from different perspectives and angles, but I've got to say it really strikes me. I was also in the Sonoma County Jeff Nathanson show, and I've been in other exhibitions, and I love standing among this community of people all looking at the same thing and just looking at a textile artist's work or a metal worker's work or weird stuff, and just looking at this and just saying, yes, they went through the same thing I did. They saw the same thing I did. They expressed it differently, but that was my experience too. And so was that in textile, and so was that in metal, and so was that in plastic, and so was that in big rusted pickup trucks standing in the middle of the room. That was all part of the experience. And, particularly those of us who lost our homes, but also pretty much anybody in Northern California, we're all kind of part of the club that nobody wants to join. We've all been through this thing that other people in other places that didn't have smoke choking their lungs for weeks on end don't quite get, and they don't quite get that feeling, that tingle that rises up your back when October rolls around and you smell wood smoke coming from some direction you can't name. So I think it's art can bind us. It can clarify experience. It can say to people, I think the greatest reaction anybody can have to art is, oh my God, I didn't know anybody felt like I felt. That artist captured something that I didn't know could be expressed, but I felt the exact same way. I think that's wonderful. And I think in an exhibition like this, you see that.
Yeah.
I think it's also really interesting when your work takes on a life of its own, and then it's brought together with the work of other artists, and you have like a dialogue between works. So it's like not only like people in dialogue, but the work is like a living thing. And that exchange between works of art around a theme, like We All Went Through Fire, is very powerful.
How much time do we have?
Got all night.
Karen, do you
We've
want
got,
to?
I think we've got a few questions here in the chat. The most recent one is Michael, who thanks you for all of you for the work on these projects. All of you have touched my heart hearing you speak about these projects, but also he's curious how all of you started making the art that you create.
You mean like way back in time? I've been a cartoonist my whole life. I just wasn't always successful at it. But actually, my first graphic novel was called Mom's Cancer, and it was a comic about my mother's treatment and diagnosis of lung cancer and the effect that had on our family. And so when my house burned down 15 years later, I said, "Oh, I know how to do this. You know, I know how to make a nonfiction, serious adult comic about a very grave subject." And you know, I was primed. I was locked and loaded. I knew what I was going to do before I didn't have to think about it. So you know, that's my medium. That's how I tell stories, and that's how I was going to do it. But the fire was not my first rodeo.
I think that creation, you know, capital C creation, like the force of nature, which creates everything, the great mystery of it all, moves through us, and it pushes us to garden, to cook, to paint, to dance. The earliest people in the world were, you know, scrawling on walls of caves. It's the natural way to participate in this magnificent, mysterious current in which we find ourselves and which moves through us.
Yes,
That's how I think all artists begin, in a way. It's
yes, I
natural.
agree.
There's a couple, did other artists want to comment on that? You guys are starting a lovely conversation. We have one question for Adam, which is extremely specific, but as an art historian, I can't hesitate and give up the opportunity to talk about iconography and symbolism and different uses of images in artists' work. You know, what do birds mean in Felicia's work? You know, what do colors mean for Brian's work? What does the shape of a vessel mean for Gregory's work? For a painter, one of the participants, Ken, asks if you could explain the use of flowers and specifically roses in your work. And I think it's very specific to Adam, but I think that Adam's way of answering that can make us think more broadly about how artists use certain objects in their work, especially if we see them repeated in their work. And Adam did talk about, you know, the flower images that you used in your work. So can you talk about that iconography and how that popped in to these fireworks?
Well, I'll say two things, because there's sort of like two parts to the question, which had to, I think your first part had to do with language, words, equations, and so forth. At least that's where I went with it. And the second part of the equation about flowers. For me, you know, there's two kinds of minds in the world. There are people who are continually pointing out the way things are different. And then there's the other group that I'm a part of, which are continually pointing out the way that things are the same. Like always looking for the theory of everything or some grand unifying theory. As a matter of fact, in physics, the theory of everything is an equation that I use in my paintings all the time. I'm looking at ways in which Buddhist scripture, poetry by Rilke, lyrics by Radiohead, and equations by physicists are kind of saying the same thing. And then I'm putting all those things together in the same painting, all pointing in the same direction. And the flowers, to me, are, I mean, they're literally and metaphorically the flowering of the plant. I mean, the flower is the most beautiful. I mean, there's fruit, we can talk about that. But the flowering of something is when it reaches its kind of climax, its most beautiful and enticing point. And yet flowers are very transient. There's never a time where a flower is just one way. It's like flower is always on an arc of coming into being and dissolution. And that's why I love flowers, because they capture, or I try and capture, like in flowers, not like to make the most beautiful flower, but to make the most poignant flower that I can. Like it's beautiful, but it's like torn apart or it's burned. So I'm always looking for capturing more than I could possibly capture. So it's like the reaching itself is what makes the work interesting.
Thank you, Adam. I want to just include this comment from Ken while he's directing it to Gregory. I think this applies to all of the artists who are here. Your work is inspiring. You gave ash or fire a second life and reborn out of fire. I want to thank Rina for organizing this really, really lovely talk tonight. I want to thank all of the artists for sharing so much with us and for their contributions to the exhibition. I encourage all of you to see the show before it closes very soon on December 10th. Please come and see the show, and please join us for the other artist talk coming up on December 9th. Thank you all. I appreciate your all being here.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
You.
It was
Thank you
great.
very much.